Tonight, Albuquerque police continue to give few details about a weekend standoff that ended with a man dead. Well, you deserve answers, and we are working to get those for you. We are in the air, taking a different look at that scene and on the ground tonight, talking to people who witnessed that confrontation. They're telling us what they saw and heard. The man was killed in the foothills during a standoff in which APD tells us less than lethal force was used. Today, police did name the officers involved in that standoff, Keith, Sandy, and Dominique Perez. Well, they are both on paid leave tonight, but APD is still not answering the biggest question that remains. Was an actual gunshot ever fired? Our Caleb James has been pressing APD for that answer, and tonight he went straight to witnesses who saw and heard what happened Sunday night. Caleb is live near the scene of that incident in the foothills near Tramway and Copper tonight. Caleb.
And Danielle, anytime there's a big story like this with a lot of unanswered questions, you want to be there. You want to understand what happened. A prickly cactus, a cluster of rocks. Would you guess right now you're in the very middle of Sunday's big story? You're in the foothills of Albuquerque, where a man died after a confrontation with police. Sometimes when you're right in the middle of a story, it's easy to lose perspective, and it's important to look at the bigger picture and understand exactly how things happen and where they happen. Now, police have not been specific about exactly where this incident took place, but it did happen somewhere in this area between the rugged terrain of the Sandia foothills and this neighborhood to the west. And Chopper 4 takes you there, those houses to the west, the outcrop of rocks to the east. That's where police say a man camping illegally threatened them. And what happened next is a mystery. But APD Chief Gordon Eden does say this.
Less than lethal was deployed, and then shots were fired.
Shots were fired. And it turns out many people heard them, too. The actual incident, we're told, took place around that cluster of rocks up the mountain. We're told that by folks who live in this neighborhood, in these houses that back directly up to this open space area. And 1, 2, 3 neighbors we talked to separately say they heard the exact same thing Sunday night. A big bang followed by 3 shots. And then there's this, a grainy cell phone video police say is now part of their investigation. Submitted to KOB by one of you, it's said to show the suspect and only the suspect. And without important perspective, it's hard to tell. Was it filmed from one of these houses? What was that big bang? What were those 3 shots? It's all part of the bigger picture. And speaking of that bigger picture, APD promises to clue us into more pieces of that picture during a news conference on Friday when they plan to release some more information. It should be mentioned tonight, as we spoke to neighbors in this nearby development, one of the neighbors we spoke to said that what he saw on Sunday night supports that APD's actions were justified. We asked him what he saw. He said he did not want to tell us. Live in the foothills tonight, I'm Caleb James, KOB, Eyewitness News.
Down at a bar or a bus stop, I have the right to kill you right now because you're trying to take me over. Don't get stupid with me.
We're not going to get stupid.
You said we were walking out of here, now you're bringing up assault and everybody's going to get hurt again? All right, don't change up your agreement. I'm going to try to walk with you.
All right.
I love folks. I'll try to harm you. Keep your word. I can keep you safe. All right? Don't worry about safety. I'm not a fucking murderer. All right? Try to harm you. Try to harm you. All right?
Do it.
Do it! Get on the ground!
Get on the ground! Get on the ground now! Get on the ground! Get on the ground!
Don't make fun of people.
Put it up! Move it up!
Get your hands up!
Still got the knives in his hand? Still got the knives in his hand.
Still got his knives in his hands.
Step it up behind you. You moving?
Don't hurt me.
His hands, he's still armed.
Yep.
Can't move.
Get your hands out.
Get
Drop
your
the
hands
knife.
up.
Lean back. Right behind you.
Put your hands out to your side and drop the knife. Hands out to your side.
Beanbag, beanbag. Drop the knife. Drop the knife. out the knife!
Still got the knife in your hand? Dog on him? Negative effect. Still got a dog on him? I can get him on him. Yeah, I don't want that knife in his head. I'll be hands-free. Still. All right, he's good. Somebody step on that right hand real hard. He's got a knife in each hand. Knife in each hand. Knife in each hand. Rex, low. I got left. Good on that. I'm gonna switch you. All right. Good. You got lethal right there? Yes. I have lethal. What's your right hand? Follow. Get that knife. It's further away from you. I didn't see where the other one went. Where'd the first knife go? Where'd the first knife's up there. There. You need another set of cuffs? Yeah, we're good, man. We're rolling over, all right? Okay. So you guys check that, make sure nobody else. Yep, got it. I'm with you. Go to my right. Okay. I'm good here. Okay. Here? Yeah, somewhere else. Right here. All right.
Albuquerque's police chief stands by his officers, stating that his officers were justified in shooting and killing a homeless camper in the foothills who had knives in his hands. But more state and city leaders are coming out and making it clear tonight that they've watched this video and they question whether those officers made the right call. This is APD Chief Gordon Eden Friday.
Do I believe it was a justified shooting? Yes. If you follow case law Garner versus Tennessee, there was a directed threat to an officer.
This weekend, city and state leaders watched this lapel cam video showing a homeless camper with mental health issues taken down with a taser, beanbags, bullets, and a canine unit. The force used by APD killed 38-year-old James Boyd.
I am troubled. I am disturbed. And I was very disappointed in Chief Eden by coming out so quickly and rendering a decision that the shooting was justified.
But in retrospect, it might have been a little much, but you can always make these judgments after the fact.
In the video, Boyd pleads with officers.
His hands still armed. Yep.
While Boyd is on the ground, APD continues to shoot at him. Then they allowed the canine unit to attack Boyd's leg.
But to hear the chief of police immediately come forward and say, hey, there's nothing to see here, nothing wrong here, I think that's egregious, and I'm very concerned about that.
Albuquerque's Mayor Richard Berry, who appointed Chief Eden, has been silent on the issue. Berry has not told his community if he backs Chief Eden's comments that the shooting was justified. And we have to tell you, hundreds, possibly thousands of our viewers have commented across our social media platforms. You can see here that Delilah writes, "Trigger happy cops. That's disgusting." Vince writes, "They need to demilitarize the police officers." And we also have here Chris, who writes that they have their focus in the wrong spot and should be looking at non-lethal forms of detainment.
I'll tell you what, if Police Chief Gordon Eden's ears are burning just a little bit this evening, there is a reason for it. His boss, the mayor, was talking about him, and it wasn't all cupcakes and cookies either.
He made a mistake. He made a mistake. He never should have said that when he said it.
Mayor Berry critical of what the chief said Friday about his officers shooting a homeless man in a foothills standoff 2 Sundays ago.
Do I believe it was a justified shooting? Yes. If you follow case law Garner versus Tennessee, there was a directed threat to an officer.
I think he was asked an honest question, and I think he gave what he thought was an honest answer. And I think he'd been briefed in some detail at that point, but I think it was a mistake for him to make that judgment.
The shooting of 38-year-old James Boyd still under investigation by APD. The county sheriff, the DA, the state police, the U.S. Department of Justice, and now the mayor has asked the Las Cruces police to join in.
We need to wait for these investigations to be done. Whether it's justified ultimately or not justified, whether there are tactical things that could be done differently, whatever that comes down to. And there will always be something. Anytime there's an officer-involved shooting, there's something to be learned. There's something to be made better.
Barry calls the shooting horrific. He was out of town when police released the shocking lapel cam video on Friday. Coming up tonight at 10, our Ryan Luby talks with Chief Eden about this. Has he changed his mind?
Demonstrators are planning to march in protest of a police shooting death of a man in the foothills. This is the Albuquerque Police Department lapel video from the incident last Sunday. Police told us the suspect, 38-year-old James Boyd, had a knife in his hand when he was shot. In the video, you can hear Boyd saying, "Please don't hurt me, I can't move." Police say they used a taser, beanbags, bullets, and then a canine unit. Boyd died as a result. APD Chief Gordon Eden told us the shooting was justified.
Do I believe it was a justified shooting? Yes. If you follow case law, Garner versus Tennessee, there was a directed threat to an officer.
Well, some state leaders say officers need to be trained better. State Senator Michael Padilla says he's concerned with the chief's reaction to the shooting.
There are a lot of hardworking police officers. In this case, maybe something happened and we don't know that. But to hear the chief of police immediately come forward and say, hey, there's nothing to see here, nothing wrong here, I think that's egregious, and I'm very concerned about that.
Well, this comes as APD faces an investigation from the U.S. Department of Justice in 36 police shootings. Mayor Richard Berry's office has not commented on this issue. And again, various groups will gather downtown tomorrow at 6 p.m. marching to police headquarters.
People angry about APD's latest fatal shooting are downtown tonight voicing their concerns. This is a live look of the protest against APD. It's from right in front of the Century 14 Theater downtown on Central.
APD has received a lot of fallout since 2 of its officers shot a homeless man camping in the foothills 2 Sundays ago. That man was James Boyd. Police say Boyd was threatening officers with knives and would not drop them. We know officers used both non-lethal and lethal force against Boyd. He was taken to the hospital where he later died.
Officers Dominique Perez and Keith Sandy were placed on leave after the shooting. Many people say the use of deadly force was not necessary in that case, and that's why they're marching in protest tonight.
Erica Zucco is at that protest live downtown where it's all happening. Erica?
Yeah, Tom and Danielle, we've been here since about 5 o'clock, and slowly that crowd has been growing. Now we're at a couple hundred people. I want you to go ahead and take a look behind me so you can see everything happening. At this point, organizers are speaking on megaphones. They've had several chants going. Now, people are here for different reasons. As you mentioned, most of them are here in honor of James Boyd, but there are also people here that are asking for action, more help for people with mental health issues, as well as people that are here for other concerns involving an APD. Now, in just a couple of minutes, they're going to start marching from here at 1st and Central, and they're going to make their way down to APD headquarters over at 4th and Roma. We'll be here on scene. We'll be back with you in just a couple of minutes with an update on the protests. Live near 1st and Central, Erica Zucco, KOB Eyewitness News 4.
Name them at Albuquerque Police websites.
It's a battle cry. Albuquerque officials are calling a serious threat. The international group of hackers is called Anonymous, infamous for infiltrating government agencies through cyber attacks. Caleb James is following the threat officials admit could affect sensitive information. Caleb?
Yeah, Danielle, Anonymous is a hacking group that is well known for successfully hacking several government agencies they consider to be violating human and civil rights. Now, with APD in its sights, Albuquerque officials say they are bracing all of their systems for a possible attack.
Greetings, City of Albuquerque. We are Anonymous.
When hacker group Anonymous calls, there's no choice but to answer.
This particular organization has a fairly robust history of success. today's world, we are anonymous.
The so-called hacktivists of Anonymous have successfully breached systems at the United States Federal Reserve and even the Vatican. Visualize a flash mob like this one on YouTube inside a shopping mall. This is sort of how Anonymous stages their cyber attacks, by flooding a website with so much unusual traffic that it just can't handle it and shuts down. In this case, the shopping mall here is APD's website, and Anonymous are the flash mobbers taking over. Business as usual is completely impossible.
The website would be rendered useless because it can't keep up with the amount of traffic that's coming at it, and that's really the intent of this perceived threat.
When will we say no more?
The group's latest video calls for members around the world to occupy APD's headquarters and website on March 30th to send a message after APD shot and killed homeless camper James Boyd in the Albuquerque foothills. Officials say they're bracing the city's cyber structure as Anonymous takes aim at APD.
Is there any sort of confidential, sensitive information that you guys are worried about getting out as a result of an attack?
Well, the city has a very, very robust and expanded and functional computer system, and so we have to look at this at multiple levels and try to ensure that our web, our information, and all of our particular modules are protected from this.
Experts tell us attacks like these are impossible to fight once they're underway, and the city acknowledged that.
If it happens, we're going to wait out the storm, so to speak.
We also asked if a cyber attack on APD's systems could possibly affect the real-time crime center, which facilitates communication between officers in the field and their supervisors at APD. We were told that that is a possibility.
Right now, it was sparked after a deadly shooting by APD officers in the foothills a few weeks ago. Well, today's protest has been going on in downtown and Nob Hill since around noon.
Twice they tried to get on Interstate 25, but were repelled by officers. In fact, I-25 was shut down because those protesters were in the lanes of traffic. And tonight, the crowd made its way to a police substation in the Nob Hill area, damaging property and squaring off with officers. Take a look at the graffiti. We've blurred out the obscenity. It looks like we don't have that shot for you, though.
Well, city officials finally responded about an hour ago, but there appears to be no end to this protest anytime soon.
We are bringing you live team coverage of this big story tonight. Eric Zuko has been speaking with city officials.
Well, we're going to start tonight with Caleb James. He has been on the scene for the entire 10 hours with protesters. Caleb?
Yeah, guys, and right now, pulling in is what looks to be an incident command unit. We are at University and Central, close by University and Central, and the reason we're live here right now is to show you a different perspective of this story. Look behind me. This is where APD, BCSO, and other law enforcement are staging here tonight. We have seen them gathering supplies, food, talking to each other, coming up with a game plan. You can see a SWAT team there in the distance getting their stuff together. Over here we have another SWAT team working to get together and discuss their plan of action, it seems. Just want to take you back to earlier today. We have a lot of video that we shot throughout the day. First off, we're going to start at I-25 and Central. This is where earlier protesters stormed the northbound lanes of I-25. We were the only crew there. We were on the street with them, on the freeway with them. It became increasingly tense, increasingly violent. Protesters yelling at passing motorists.
Where's Mayor Barry? Where's Susanna Martinez? We demand to be heard! We are the revolution!
We need peace. We need to wake up. The people need to open their eyes. We need to come together. We need to show love. We need to stop hating.
Okay, as you see there, they did have some protesters eventually climbing up onto light poles in Nob Hill. They also had protesters climbing up onto some police substations in Nob Hill. We also had some tear gas launched tonight that is kind of finally dispersed.
Albuquerque gets more national attention after hundreds of protesters clashed with police.
Tonight, what police and city leaders are saying, and could we see more rallies?
We want justice! We want justice!
It started with hundreds peacefully chanting, but as the day wore on, so did the tone. It changed, too, of a protest against an APD shooting.
The violence last night, it rattled the city, and you could still see the aftermath right there this morning. Now many people are simply afraid to even ask, what's next?
Our Caleb James was in the middle of that protest for its full 12 hours yesterday. He was at the briefing by APD Chief Gordon Eden just a short time ago. And Caleb, what did the chief have to say?
Well, guys, there is a lot of information we want to catch you up on this evening, including the question of just how many people APD arrested as a result of this protest. I will get to that number in just a moment. First, though, some details for you. Police say the protest hovered at around 350 people throughout the day and the evening. It did not grow, but the tone of that protest, they say, certainly changed, and that is when riot police moved in. First, though, APD Chief Gordon Eden acknowledged today what many of us already know. This protest began peacefully. He tells us APD was in constant contact with the original organizers and that they initially tipped off police that the action was turning disorderly. Now, APD confirms they have information. Protesters began fighting with each other. There was no leadership within that group. He also indicated that protesters were actively seeking out police. I should be specific. There was no leadership in the group toward the end of the night, the more violent group toward the end of the night. Now, police say those protesters were trying to engage police rather than avoiding them, and that's when this protest turned violent, specifically when protesters swarmed the northbound lanes of I-25 at Central Avenue. Eden says that crowd blocked first responder access to an injury crash at that intersection.
The mob did, in fact, obstruct emergency response into that area. They also blocked the emergency room access to Presbyterian Hospital. I know how many we arrested, which was 4.
You heard Gordon in there say 4 people were arrested as a result of the protest. By the end of the night, though, these 6 people were arrested by APD, all of them charged with disorderly conduct. None are older than 24, and none, we are told, have a criminal history. Now, today, police tell us 2 of those arrests are unrelated to the protest, even though they were made in the same general location and at the same time as the others. And, of course, a big question tonight, why did APD decide to deploy tear gas on those protesters? We will have an answer from APD Chief Gordon Eden tonight coming up at 6 o'clock. For now, though, live downtown, I'm Caleb James, KOB Eyewitness News 4.
Tonight, we are also hearing from Mayor Richard Berry. He says he supports the First Amendment and the right people have to protest, but he criticizes the protesters who started breaking the law. The mayor says officers handle themselves well despite the obvious tension.
Talked to a young man yesterday, one of the officers, who talked about being, somebody spit in his face and somebody hit him in the back with what he thought maybe a rock or something. We had objects being hurled at officers, and the fact that they were able to de-escalate those situations, I think, speaks highly for their professionalism.
This whole situation started just over 2 weeks ago. On March 16th, 2 officers shot and killed James Boyd. Police say the mentally ill homeless man was camping illegally in the foothills. The Pell camera video of the shooting went viral. 9 days later, on March 25th, hundreds of protesters marched along Central to APD headquarters. Just hours after that protest, another deadly APD shooting. An officer shot and killed Alfred Redwine. Police say Redwine was armed and fired first. Then yesterday, a protest that started peacefully turned confrontational when the sun went down. Until today, we've never heard from James Boyd's family.
But tonight, his brother comes forward in a story you'll only see on 4.
They gunned him down. That's all there is to it.
It's a simple yet powerful answer from Boyd's younger brother, Andrew. We talked to him just hours after he found out the man at the center of a national story and violent protests was his own flesh and blood.
It's sad that I found out 2 weeks later after my brother's death.
Andrew wouldn't say exactly how he got that information or comment on the last time he talked to his brother, but he had plenty to say about the controversy surrounding his death.
Picture you have a sibling, whether it be a brother or a sister. Watch them on a YouTube video get shot down and have a police dog bite you and bite you and bite you and then gun down again.
When it comes to Boyd's reported mental illness, Andrew didn't know anything about those issues. And when we asked about his brother allegedly having knives during that Foothills situation,
his excuse is always, I have knives, don't come near me. Is a personal defense.
While he still has questions for APD about his brother's death, he is certain about this.
I want justice for my brother. His death is extremely unjustified.
Now, we do want to point out that Andrew lives in Alabama now, and he told us that he is the only one in his family who has seen the video of his brother being shot in the Foothills. He says it's simply too disturbing for his parents to watch.
The James Boyd shooting has some state lawmakers talking about big changes, primarily laws dealing with mentally ill people who are considered a threat to public safety.
But now the governor says not so fast. Stuart Dyson is in our newsroom with the latest on what they call Kendra's Law. Stu?
Tessa, Tom, New Mexico is one of a handful of states that does not have a Kendra's Law. That's a law that requires dangerous mental patients to take their medications and get psychiatric treatment. James Boyd, in and out of jail and mental hospitals over and over again, committing crimes, sometimes violent, but mentally incompetent to stand trial. Turned out on the streets. It all ends up in the Foothills in a fatal confrontation with the cops. Some say now is the time to reconsider Kendra's Law, but Governor Martinez says hold your horses.
I think what's first important is that we find out what happened, that a full, detailed investigation, including whether that was played a part in it or not, be done by the FBI, which is we want the public to have faith and confidence in whatever results from that investigation.
An earlier case that sparked a Kendra's Law debate, John Hyde, back in 2005, mental patient, off his meds, killed 2 cops and 3 civilians. The legislature didn't go for it. The city of Albuquerque actually had a version of Kendra's Law on the books for a while, but the courts shot that one down. Opponents argue that the government doesn't have any business forcing people to take medications, even violent mental patients.
Well, Tom and Tessa, I had the chance to sit down with the mayor one-on-one here at his office this evening. Aside from the investigation itself, I asked him if his new police chief, Chief Gordon Eden, should resign in wake of these protests, and wondered if these protests could hurt our chances with Tesla Motors.
For no reason, another person dead, huh?
Bad news can hurt. In a city where some distrust their police and want the new police chief to get out, it can hurt that much more. Yes, it's an issue raised on the streets, but not in the office.
No.
Not at all.
No.
It's not on Mayor Barry's agenda to improve Albuquerque's image. Should the chief resign?
No. We have a chief that's been there for 30 days. And already he has come to my office with multiple things that he wants to do, from training to procedural changes to organizational changes that he feels are best for the department, best for the community, best for the men and women that work in that department.
The mayor says Chief Gordon Eden brought all of that to the table before the shooting in the Foothills. As for the shooting itself and the protests that followed, the mayor says the headlines have not hurt our chances with Tesla Motors. That's the company that may choose Albuquerque as the place to build its brand new lithium battery factory, complete with 6,500 jobs.
I've actually asked some of the professionals working on that situation, and there's been no communication with anyone along those lines.
So despite how bad the news in our city has been in the last 2 weeks, the mayor says we're actually investigating our problems.
If we weren't doing that, I think people would be concerned.
And that he believes he's handling his leadership of the city appropriately. Well, over and over again, the mayor keeps reminding us that now 6 agencies are investigating that shooting in the foothills. And until that investigation is over, he says we cannot definitively draw conclusions. And by the way, in a news conference with the police chief this afternoon, he told us that they have a new recruiting effort that they're pursuing to hire new officers called Recruiting for the New Millennia, but they would not detail exactly what that means. Reporting live downtown, I'm Ryan Luby, KOB Eyewitness News 4.
Some activists say the mayor wouldn't be so willing to work more closely with the DOJ were not for the release of lapel camera video showing James Boyd's shooting.
Erica Zucco is here with how they think the lapel camera system can actually be improved. Erica?
Yeah, Tessa and Tom, the ACLU says that this video opened people's eyes to how APD officers can escalate situations from difficult to dangerous to sometimes deadly. They say APD needs to have a zero-tolerance policy requiring officers to roll their lapel cameras on every call. This video of James Boyd being tasered, shot, and beanbagged in the foothills has sparked protests and perhaps a decision by Mayor Berry.
I think if we did not have that body-worn cam footage, we may not be having this debate in the city of Albuquerque right now, and we may not be watching the mayor come out with a request that the DOJ finally intervene in the department.
The ACLU says video showing what officers saw, heard, and decided to do was more revealing than any written report could be.
It showed us that the APD escalates situations with people, particularly if they're homeless and if they're mentally ill, creating situations where using lethal force is almost inevitable. That we think is probably a pattern that has never gone recorded.
But the ACLU says too often officers forget to turn on cameras or choose not to.
We'd like to see City Council pass legislation that requires officers to use body-worn cameras for every incident, every encounter with a citizen, and that they create higher penalties for officers to make sure that those cameras are used.
Right now, officers are required to roll their cameras during certain incidents, including domestic violence calls, custody disputes, and cases where someone is disobeying an officer. But the ACLU says they should be used all the time.
Fire the chief! Fire the chief! Fire the chief!
Albuquerque's mayor did something today that may please protesters who are upset with recent police shootings.
He has invited the Department of Justice to set up inside APD to monitor what it does. It sounds like a huge step, but is it?
Our Caleb James has been following this story. And Caleb, this announcement really kind of comes at an interesting time, to say the least.
Yeah, guys, and perhaps very revealing. This announcement comes after a large-scale protest against the city's police department, and only days after the FBI's announcement they will, for the first time, launch a criminal investigation into an APD shooting, the one that killed homeless man James Boyd. The Department of Justice has been investigating the department for 2 years, and we've anticipated a report soon. So was today's announcement an effort to get out in front of the DOJ's final report?
This in no way should be even thought as of us asking or even suggesting a Department of Justice takeover.
It's not a takeover.
It's an auditing function in one way. But also, we see it more than that. We see it as a collaborative opportunity.
Mayor Berry Wednesday says he's asked the Department of Justice to work within APD's offices to monitor the department as reforms are made and to help set benchmarks for new reform.
One people, one voice!
The announcement comes 3 days after protesters swarmed APD headquarters and demanded change. And as the FBI announces a criminal investigation into the shooting of homeless man James Boyd in the Albuquerque foothills, could it be the city's effort to step up transparency before the DOJ forces it?
The easy thing to do would probably be to point fingers.
Instead, Berry has invited DOJ agents deeper into the department.
No justice, no peace!
After similar outrage over police use of force in Seattle, the DOJ decided to take over that city's police department entirely, something that could still happen if Berry's request is denied.
And thank you for coming today.
But if his request is approved, Berry says DOJ monitors would work at APD with commanders. He says it could be one person in charge with a team of others, but in any case, their work would be funded by the city, by you. Meantime, Barry says APD Chief Gordon Eden is already making big changes, including crisis intervention training for all officers on the force. Back to you.
It not only prepares us for a new direction for the department.
And tonight, APD Chief Gordon Eden says that change starts with accountability.
This comes after tension over APD's strained relationship with the Albuquerque community reached a boiling point last weekend. Now, next week, a new deputy chief tasked with keeping officers in check will start work.
Tonight, Chief Eden sat down with our Caleb James to talk about that new position and the difference it could make. Caleb.
And Chief Eden says it's a new leadership role at the top for a better APD. The 4th Deputy Chief will be directly responsible for making sure all Department of Justice recommendations are followed, but that is just the beginning of their job description.
There are things that I can do right now, and those are the things that I'm focused on.
How do we turn the tide?
We build that trust, and we just make that trust stronger and stronger every day.
For APD Chief Gordon Eden, we work together, and he says his work has already begun.
I want to put together a very robust employee monitoring system.
It starts with a new deputy chief, a person Eden says will oversee every single step of an officer's career with APD.
From when a person puts in their application, they go through the hiring process, they go through the training process, the field training officer program, and then they're out on their own as a police officer.
And then there will be follow-through. The new chief, who starts next week, will also oversee the department's behavioral science unit, the APD arm that counsels and evaluates officers after they're involved in use of force.
Professional accountability. And so that's why it's important. I have one person dedicated to just that.
Accountability for the bad and for the good things officers do, something Eden says can build a strong house.
Those are the things that establish our foundation.
And as for distractions, as for that still lingering possibility of a full DOJ takeover.
Are you prepared for that? I mean, do you think about that? What are your feelings about that possibility?
I actually don't have any feelings about that, and I don't mean that in an arrogant way at all. My focus right now is to keep this department moving forward and making those necessary changes.
Protesters made it clear they wanted no violence as they hit the streets again tonight, and they continue to ask for justice in the deadly police shooting of a mentally ill homeless man.
What we saw today was probably what protesters last weekend had in mind when they first started demonstrating in Civic Plaza before things went bad. Today's group was mostly peaceful, but at one point things almost got out of hand.
And Caleb James has been following the protesters since this afternoon. He's live tonight at Civic Plaza. Caleb.
And guys, the only remnant, the only sign that there was a protest here tonight is a sign very symbolic of exactly what these protesters tonight wanted this protest to be like. And for the most part, it was protesters chanting out for justice for a man they say APD murdered.
It's a huge symbolism, it's a metaphor.
Derek Lanebull wore his gas mask today to make a point.
This is a peaceful protest!
What happened last Sunday doesn't need to happen again.
I'm so happy it's been peaceful.
And this time it was. Protesters stuck to the sidewalks and cried out for justice for James Boyd, whose friends called him Abba.
It's just such a beautiful thing to see that we're actually standing up and rising and, against everything that we fear.
And then suddenly, just before 9 o'clock, things changed.
We are peaceful!
A small group encouraged the protesters to choose violence over peace. One of them even shoving our KOB crew. But this time, peace and the peaceful prevailed.
These people that are trying to incite violence do not represent us.
505! 505! 505!
And those chants of 505, of course, the Albuquerque area code were followed by chants of "We love Albuquerque." Just about 25 minutes ago, this group kind of dispersed and left the area, and we're left with this idea that this protest was meant to be peaceful. And by the end of the night, it was. Reporting live at Civic Plaza downtown, I'm Caleb James.
Albuquerque Mayor Richard Berry
News.
today proposed $1 million to train APD officers in de-escalation tactics.
The announcement comes more than 2 weeks after police shot and killed homeless man James Boyd in the foothills, sparking protests against APD. Police say Boyd was shot after threatening them with knives.
Critics argue the officers resorted to lethal force too quickly. But tonight, the president of the police union says training is welcome, but reform starts at the top.
Caleb James is live tonight at APT headquarters with the revealing interview. Caleb.
Well, guys, APD Union President Stephanie Lopez says officers can always use more thorough training, additional training. She also says there's a bigger problem at play, and tonight she tells New Mexicans why she believes the new chief, Gordon Eden, cannot do his job.
After anti-APD protests rocked Albuquerque, Stephanie Lopez has only one word to describe officer morale.
Disheartened.
Well, thank you, everybody, for coming today.
Mayor Berry Tuesday says he wants $1 million to train officers how to better approach people living with mental illness.
And also a focus on de-escalation and other crisis intervention strategies.
But as far as specifics go, both Berry's office and APD won't say what new training will look like.
You can never be trained enough.
Lopez says Chief Gordon Eden should be progressive with cutting-edge training courses.
It's called Force Science.
She wants leadership to consider the Force Science Research Center. It compiles data from police shootings across the nation to formulate best practices.
They do it in different states, but it's never been held here.
Lopez also wants all officers to receive 40 hours of crisis intervention training instead of only a select few.
Because it's micromanaged.
But Lopez says things can't change without independent thinkers at the top.
I would prefer to have Alan Banks running this department because he wasn't dictated and controlled.
She says the new chief won't take control like his predecessor.
He stood up to the 11th floor a lot more than what Schultz or Chief Eden has had the opportunity to do.
APD told us that specifics about new training practices will be released at a later date. We also contacted APD for response to Stephanie Lopez's comments about leadership.
The Answer Coalition, an anti-police brutality group that's been active in Albuquerque for about 3 years, held a meeting to discuss how grassroots efforts can play a role in APD reform.
Erica Zucco was there, and Erica, much of the focus was actually on looking backward.
Yeah, Tom and Tessa, the meeting actually started with a history lesson going back to 1987 about police shootings in Albuquerque. Organizers wanted activists to know what reforms have been attempted already and what obstacles they could face going forward. Tonight's meeting started with a moment of silence. Organizers added the names of James Boyd and Alfred Redwine to a coffin covered with names and photos of people shot by Albuquerque police. One of them, Kenneth Ellis III, whose father now advocates with the Answer Coalition.
About the IRO, Independent Review Officer, the POC, which is the Police Oversight Committee, all these entities that are supposed to be monitoring and keeping our cops in check are nothing more than a farce. They're a joke. The system has broke.
Tonight, his son's death was hailed as an eye-opener to the community about police shootings. In fact, the city owes his family more than $7 million after losing a lawsuit. James Boyd's death was discussed as the latest. While some Answer Coalition members criticized protesters that got out of line Sunday, members like Ellis appreciate the community at least speaking up.
I think it's good that awareness of the police brutality is coming to light. I'm a little discouraged about some of the tactics that have been, Albuquerque police showed their true colors on Sunday night by gearing all up in riot gear and getting ready for combat.
Members plan to pack Monday night's city council meeting, which will focus on reforming the board that's supposed to oversee APD.
Hopefully we can get some teeth put into the Police Oversight Commission so the civilians really have a look-see at what's going on.
The City Council president says he's deferred all other agenda items for Monday's meeting. He expects a large number of people to be there to comment about reforms for the Police Oversight Commission and thinks it will take hours to get through them.
People are taking to the streets chanting their opinions for and against the Albuquerque Police Department. But tomorrow night will be the first time citizens have a direct line to their government officials regarding that issue. Caleb James is here with more. Caleb.
And tomorrow, Danielle, the Albuquerque City Council is clearing its schedule to discuss public safety-related issues. That includes, of course, police oversight and the recent unrest over police brutality. But more importantly, to give anyone who wants to address the council the opportunity to do so.
We want justice! We want justice! We want justice!
It's hard to believe this scene was happening exactly 1 week ago at almost this very same time. Protesters fed up with police shootings last Sunday wanted their voices heard, and that desire to be listened to has not let up. Demonstrators hit the streets again Friday for a peaceful march. But the decision makers are in here, and tomorrow they will likely be settling in for a long night. Council President Ken Sanchez has cleared the council's agenda to make room for anyone who wants to voice their concerns about APD. So far, the Answer Coalition has indicated they are planning a strong presence at that meeting. Now, here's your 4 facts about Monday's council meeting. The meeting begins at 5:00 p.m. It's at the City Council chambers at 1 Civic Plaza. That's City Hall downtown. Now remember, a lot of groups are planning to attend. Arrive early for parking and seating. And keep in mind, you must sign up if you want to speak in front of the council. Well, city councilors are asking for you to tell them how you feel. A cleared agenda tomorrow. If you have something to say, that will be the time to do it. We will, of course, be there to bring you what happens.
So far,
Danielle,
we've seen the lapel camera video from just one of the 2 officers in the James Boyd shooting. It's from Officer Dominique Perez. KOB Eyewitness News 4 has asked for the other recordings. However, on Wednesday, the city denied our request for lapel camera and audio recordings from Officer Keith Sandy. The city says the FBI wants to protect the integrity of the investigation. Today, New Mexico State Police, also involved in the investigation, denied our request. State police say the FBI has specifically requested that evidence not be released. You can read the entire 2-page document denying public access to those records at KOB.com under 4 links.
Protests against Albuquerque police have been making headlines worldwide, but today at least 100 people showed their support for officers and the department. Jen Samp is live downtown with the story. Jen?
That's right. Many at the APD support rally say they worry about officer morale, which is why they want their law enforcement to know they stand behind them. Those standing on the steps at APD headquarters today say they're a far cry from the protesters of the past week.
If you notice, there's nobody out here wearing a mask. So the people that are out here today, they actually are proud of what they stand for.
Over 100 people came to support APD officers. Kathy Beard was one of them.
I think they're out here to protect us, and nobody's walking in their shoes. So until you walk in their shoes, you really can't judge them.
The crowd wanted to show APD they still believe in them, despite 3 recent protests against APD over the shooting death of James Boyd, a homeless man camping in the foothills last month. Last Sunday, protesters laid down on I-25. There were multiple reports of vandalism, and officers used tear gas to control the crowds.
That was total anarchy. It was disgusting. It was violent. It just showed why we need police officers on the street.
Whether we are protesters or supporters.
APD supporters agree change is needed. More officer training is required, but they would rather find a solution using support instead of protest.
You know, all the criticism they've been getting and the negative publicity, people make mistakes. We understand that, but we also understand how important APD is in our society.
And there will be another pro-APD rally at the APD headquarters Saturday at 10 a.m. Live downtown, Jen Sam, KOB Eyewitness News 4.
Thank you, Caleb. Continuing our team coverage tonight, more support for APD is popping up now on social media. Jen Samp is in our newsroom tonight with more on how local veterans plan to step up for officers. Jen?
And Danielle, the Veteran Support for APD Facebook group says they do not agree with the actions of the officers involved involved in the shooting of James Boyd. But this group can relate with the men and women in blue, which is why they support them. In Derek Bennett's eyes, a person in uniform is a person in uniform, whether they are overseas in the military or a police officer in Albuquerque. He started the Facebook group Veteran Support for APD. He says it's to counter the APD protests within the past week.
Me being an Iraq veteran, I know that you can do your best every day to do the best job that you can to make a difference. There's still going to be a few people that just ruin it for you.
He says he reviewed the lapel cam video in the shooting of James Boyd.
We don't condone the James Boyd shooting. Okay, we don't. We understand that there was some issues going on there that maybe could have been settled a different way.
Bennett served 3 tours for the U.S. Army in Iraq and Afghanistan. He and his group of veterans came up with some solutions they think could prevent this from happening again.
Does there need to be reform? There certainly does need to be reform.
For starters, veterans will suggest every officer have backup, having 2 officers per unit.
Just like in the military, you got your battle buddy.
The most experienced officers should be assigned to the areas of highest crime, and all should receive training to recognize the mentally ill.
For us veterans to voice our opinion and say, we have your back, that's huge. That's huge.
The group is calling for as many veterans as possible to go to tomorrow's City Council meeting, and they're hoping to present their ideas.
Days, we're going to hear from the Department of Justice as well. The agency will release its findings about APD that began investigating APD's use of force in late 2012. Ryan Luby continues our team coverage, also live at Civic Plaza. And Ryan, I would imagine the mayor has to be pretty happy about this.
Well, indeed he is. Remember, just the other day, he wrote a letter to the DOJ saying, hey, let's get this thing done. Just as opinions overflowed council chambers into Civic Plaza, Mayor Richard Berry stepped away from a community meeting in northeast Albuquerque to offer his.
That's an important starting point for us as a city, because until we know what's in that report, we're not able to fully move forward.
Berry can only speculate about the report, but expects certain aspects of it to mirror DOJ investigations conducted in more than a dozen cities in the last few years.
It could be anything from taking over the department, so to speak, like in Seattle, to some kind of a stipulated agreement like in Portland or other places.
As for the concerns raised in Albuquerque in the last 3 weeks, he says he's confident that he's addressed some of them even before the protests began. He says his staff implemented a number of reforms since 2010, including the purchase and use of lapel cameras, the very devices that captured the shooting of James Boyd. Still, he says he welcomes any recommendations from the DOJ and left the door wide open for them the whole time.
It's not an us against them situation. We gave them direct access to the police department rather than having to filter things through the mayor's office, and I think that's been an important part of the process.
No, we asked Chief Gordon Eden to speak with us on camera tonight, but he did not want to do that. Instead, he offered us a statement, and it says, this is a positive development, and we welcome the findings of the DOJ. And as the Albuquerque Police Department has done for the past several years, we will continue to work cooperatively with the DOJ in order to implement the best practices for our community. Again, the DOJ will release its findings into this year-and-a-half investigation Thursday morning at 10 o'clock at the U.S. Attorney's Office. We will bring it to you live on air and online at KOB.com. Reporting live at Civic Plaza, I'm Ryan Luby, KOB Eyewitness.
Today, James Boyd would have turned 39 years old. Police say the schizophrenic homeless man was illegally camping in the foothills and would not put down 2 knives he had.
And after a standoff, 2 officers opened fire, killing him. Only on 4. Investigative reporter Chris Ramirez is live near where that shooting happened.
Chris has new details about Boyd's family and plans for a funeral that is open to the public. Chris.
And Tom and Tessa, you are right. Today is April 8th, James Boyd's birthday. As you would imagine, it's a very difficult day for his family, who now lives in Oregon, California, and Alabama. Now, they've been watching what's been going on here in Albuquerque. They've seen all the raw emotion surrounding the way James Boyd died here in these foothills. Now that family is hoping that the Albuquerque community turns that raw emotion into some positive action. Most New Mexicans only know James Boyd by this video. By now, we've seen the last hours of his life, frame by frame, second by second.
The family experienced James Boyd as loving and generous and intelligent, and also as someone suffering from a debilitating mental illness.
Boyd moved to Albuquerque years ago when his father moved here. When his parents moved away years later, James stayed, but his mental illness often left him homeless.
He was someone who loved nature, and he would always seek peace in nature, as he had such difficulty at times connecting with other human beings. So the tragedy is that he was killed somewhere where he thought he could find peace.
Shannon Kennedy, who now represents Boyd's family, is working to bring his family to Albuquerque this weekend for a funeral service. His mother can't bring herself, however, to watch the video that the rest of us have seen.
No one should have to see their son murdered on tape. No mother should ever have to see such a thing.
James Boyd's family has watched the protest in Albuquerque and are thankful for the support. They now want to focus their efforts on laying their son to rest and finding justice.
Justice in the criminal justice system are the shooting officers being held personally and criminally responsible for murdering a homeless man. I mean, they're going to be participating in the federal criminal prosecution of the men who murdered their son.
You're not using the word murder lightly here.
I've never used that word before, but that is what is on that video. There is probable cause on that video to arrest 2 men for murder, and yet they are still at home. The taxpayers are paying for their leave, and but for the fact they were in an APD uniform, based on that video alone, they would be in handcuffs.
More now about James Boyd's funeral. It will be open to the public. It will be held this coming Sunday at 11 a.m. at St. Martin's Hospitality Center. That's in downtown Albuquerque. Afterward, the casket will be taken to a cemetery, and James Boyd will be buried here in Albuquerque. Again, the entire public is invited to attend 11 a.m. Sunday, St. Martin's Hospitality Center.
We have concluded that a full civil rights investigation is warranted to determine whether APD engages in a pattern or practice of violations of the Constitution or federal law.
November 27, 2012, the Department of Justice launches its investigation into the Albuquerque Police Department. The news came after APD officers shot 23 men in 2 years. 17 of those men died.
But if there's things that we need to fix, we're not going to shy away from that discussion.
The DOJ began looking into not only police shootings, but also claims of excessive force. During the span of the DOJ investigation, a change in leadership at APD.
I look forward to the next chapter in my life. It's been a great ride.
Longtime Police Chief Ray Schultz announced his retirement last year. Interim Police Chief Alan Banks took the lead for 6 months.
I'm now the Chief of Police for this department, and I have the way that I'm going to do things my way.
Things that I can do right now.
And before Gordon Eden took over in February, promising change.
We build that trust, and we just make that trust stronger and stronger every day.
Since the DOJ investigation began, 9 more officer-involved shootings, 6 of them fatal, including the shooting of a homeless man in the foothills just last month. The death of James Boyd, captured on police lapel camera video, has gotten national attention.
Thank you so much for coming.
Mayor Berry did an about-face, inviting a DOJ monitor to look inside APD.
Because I don't want it to be misconstrued as a lack of faith in our department. And I want the community to know that we're listening and we're taking their concerns seriously.
It saddens me.
But nothing from City Hall quelled the outrage of those demanding change.
You're not needed. You don't do any good.
Hundreds of protesters. A city at times divided. And after a nearly 2-year-long investigation, the Department of Justice is ready to weigh in.
As Tom Joles briefly mentioned, the shooting death of James Boyd has been the centerpiece of outrage and violent protests against APD.
Boyd was a homeless camper in the foothills last month when police were called out to remove him. They say he refused to drop 2 knives, and that's why he was shot. Boyd had a history of mental illness. Multiple sources in positions of influence have confirmed to us that the FBI is looking into APD officer Keith Sandy.
He's one of the 2 officers who killed Boyd, and these sources confirmed that belt tape audio picked up Sandy's voice before he shot Boyd. What Sandy said may have been enough for Governor Susana Martinez to order state police to not release information or evidence to APD
instead delivering it straight to the FBI.
The FBI may be looking at the conduct of all the officers present in the foothills, including the other triggerman, Dominique Perez.
Tomorrow morning, James Boyd, the schizophrenic man killed by APD officers in the foothills, will be laid to rest. Boyd's death sparked outrage in our community after video showed police officers shoot, tase, beanbag, and send in a canine to attack Boyd for camping illegally. Boyd's family is in Albuquerque this weekend. They spoke only to my co-anchor and investigative reporter, Chris Ramirez.
He was just camping. That's all he was doing.
It's never easy to say goodbye.
Right there where those rocks are.
For the first time, James Boyd's brother, sister-in-law, mother, and friend hiked.
This is where it happened.
To the very place Boyd lost his life.
Right here's where he was laying.
During this dark time for them, they placed electric candles, hoping that it'll shed some light on why he lost his life.
God grant me serenity to things I cannot change.
Boyd's death was caught on APD video. His family saw the moment when officers shot Boyd with bullets. Then, already on the ground, they continued to attack him. After the visit to the foothills, I sat down with Boyd's brother, Andrew Jones. Do you think the Albuquerque Police Department murdered your brother?
I do. I definitely believe that was murder.
Tell me why.
He was going to cooperate, and he was gathering his stuff like they planned on doing, and then they threw the flashbang at him, and as he turned, they shot him.
From his home in Alabama, Andrew has seen our community come together, taking a stand for his brother. To all those people who have come out to hold vigils, protests on behalf of your brother, what do you say to them?
I want to say thank you very much. They've given us so much support. A lot of them, or most of them, didn't even know him. But this situation, knowing this happened to one person, it's going to happen to more. Because of my brother, everybody is taking a stance, and changes will be made.
Andrew says his brother always loved nature, favoring the outside versus in. These family photos show James Boyd as a child doing his favorite things. It's a twist of irony to them that James was killed where he thought he could find peace. If you had an opportunity to sit down one-on-one with the chief of police in Albuquerque, how do you think that conversation would go? What would you tell him?
I don't think the conversation would go very well. Obviously, the way the department's being run is wrong.
Andrew's family watched Chief Gordon Eden mutter these words after Boyd's death.
Do I believe it was a justified shooting? Yes. If you follow case law, Garner versus Tennessee, there was a directed threat to an officer.
I saw that online, and I cannot describe how angry and upset I was when I heard him say those words. I mean, if that was his son, and somebody said, oh, it was justified, how would he feel?
Andrew feels instead of our system helping his brother's mental health needs,
he'll be arrested tomorrow.
He was instead sentenced to death. Chris Ramirez, KOB, Eyewitness News 4.
Well, Danielle, protesters told me today that they're trying to keep people engaged. But at each rally since the death of James Boyd, fewer Albuquerque citizens have come out to protest. The first protest following the death of James Boyd brought nearly 1,000 people to the steps of APD. Activists, politicians, and families came together with one focus: justice for James Boyd.
We want to show that that we care, that we want to change things, that they're not working the way they are.
5 days later, the group Anonymous spearheaded a protest. It was about half the size, less organized, and led to tear gas, graffiti, and arrests. The following Friday, protesters warned each other to remain peaceful as they marched again.
It's just such a beautiful thing to see that we're actually standing up and rising and, against everything that we fear.
This time, the group was visibly smaller than the last, And it was unclear who was leading things or what their message was, aside from, "This is a peaceful protest." A protest planned for after the Department of Justice announcement turned out to be a dud, no one showing up. And today,
I'm kind of disappointed the turnout's small today, but with these things, they come and go.
Only about 100 people took to Civic Plaza to speak out against shootings. Most of them were familiar faces, people who've been involved with the struggle against what they call police brutality for years.
Now, some people that I talked to today said that, yes, there were around 100 people here, fewer than in the past, but they think that keeping the message out there will keep city officials accountable. Live downtown, Erica Zucco, KOB Eyewitness News 4.
Weeks, Boyd's story and his image have turned into a symbol of the movement to reform APD. But today wasn't about that message. It was about him as he lived instead of how he died.
And I know he watches over.
This was James Boyd's final walk. And this time, he had a lot of company.
Today we honor a man who was like us.
No anger, only understanding.
My brother James was never forgotten. He was always loved.
For a man who became the symbol of a system many say is broken.
James wants you to stand up and get involved. Not to do violence in our community, but to make change possible.
Boyd's family and about 100 other people attended the small service at the St. Martin's Shelter in downtown Albuquerque.
He was like us.
To remember James Boyd for how he lived and not how he died.
Up above my head, I hear music in the air.
And of all days, as new life springs up all around, with change already in the air.
And I really believe, oh, I believe there's a heaven out there.
James Boyd found his final peace on a warm day, surrounded by family and friends.
There's a heaven somewhere.
The shooting of James Boyd not only put the spotlight on the Albuquerque Police Department, but the needs of the mentally ill and the homeless.
Now we are asking an Albuquerque City Councilor how the city will help people like Boyd. Jen Sam tracked down some members of the council.
Jen Samp, what did they have to say?
Well, City Councilor Isaac Benton tells me he has never seen this kind of public outcry before. He says it is clear that the needs of the mentally ill and homeless require more attention.
Parks and, like alleys and stuff, someplace where it's safe.
Teresa and Pete are part of the large homeless population in Albuquerque. Teresa says they're getting back on their feet, but it wasn't without the programs made available by the city.
The health care for the homeless, the St. Martin's, I got my ID.
It's these kind of programs that City Councilor Isaac Benton wants to expand with more funding.
There are places where funds get shifted, and that's the prerogative of the council. It's a reflection of what the council's priorities are.
Benton says this is in light of the James Boyd shooting. Boyd was schizophrenic, homeless, and had many run-ins with the law.
My sense is no one was really tracking him. Again, revolving door in and out of the jail.
Benton says they want to work with the Bernalillo County Jail to improve treatment for substance abuse and mental illness in hopes people like James Boyd won't fall through the cracks.
It didn't seem as though he had very many human contacts with many people, much less our social service providers.
Teresa says this is all good news that came from a bad situation.
That was a very terrible thing that happened. And if it took that to recognize this, on both sides of the coin, you got to look at the good and the bad and take it for the yin and yang.
Now, Benton says 4 years ago, the funding for programs like Albuquerque Heading Home were cut. Now he says he wants to double that funding. Live in Newsroom, Jen Samp, KOB Eyewitness News.
The Justice Department is going to give Albuquerque a federal monitor to oversee new reforms that are meant to reduce excessive use of force by APD.
The city now has the big task of selecting that monitor. Stuart Dyson got some insight into what makes for an ideal candidate. Stu.
Guys, this is still a kind of murky, confused sort of process, but everything is pointing towards a federal monitor, and everybody associated with this thing says there's going to be one. So negotiations are underway on those reforms, and already community leaders here are thinking about the qualifications for the person who will oversee that compliance for years to come. APD! It's going to be a tough job, and it's going to take a remarkable person. Other cities in a similar situation have chosen high-profile community leaders with experience and expertise in both law enforcement and civil rights. They don't always go together. Nobody knows that better than Ed Perea, a retired 24-year APD cop who's now a lawyer.
There has to be some level of understanding and sensitivity to the role that a police officer performs on a day-to-day basis. On the other hand, they have to have a clear understanding of constitutional issues as it relates to how police officers do their jobs.
City Council President Ken Sanchez called for a federal monitor a year and a half ago.
But I think it's got to be someone that has a great knowledge in constitutional rights, civil rights, and also understands municipalities that have been through these problems in cities.
Legislative leader Mo Maestas likes the idea of experience.
Maybe someone who's done it before, someone who's had success, someone who understands what cops go through, but also understands civil rights, and maybe someone who has familiarity with Latino populations.
Maybe the key requirement, that person must have no ties to the police agency involved. That federal monitor could be at work here in Albuquerque for up to 5 years and maybe even longer. In the negotiation process that's underway right now, the Justice Department and city leaders are going to be figuring out exactly how this monitor will be selected and then figure out who it's going to be.
The city says the majority of the police shootings between 2009 and 2012 involve people with mental health issues. In addressing that concerning trend today, the Justice Department says it'll take more than just police to correct that trend.
I think that one of the reforms that we'd like to see the department implement is giving officers tools and techniques to diffuse situations with mentally ill individuals or people who are in mental health crisis.
Right now, the city says officers receive 60 hours of crisis intervention training. The mayor would like to increase that training and has budgeted $1 million to pay for it. A case cited often in the DOJ investigation involves Kenneth Ellis. In January 2010, Albuquerque police believed Ellis was involved in a car theft and pulled him over in a parking lot. But when Ellis got out of his car, he was holding a gun to his head. After negotiations failed, Ellis was shot and killed by an APD officer. The DOJ wrote in its findings that there is a significant amount of the force we reviewed was used against persons with mental illness and in crisis. Also, the use of technology and other initiatives have had limited impact in increasing accountability or promoting safer encounters with individuals suffering from mental illness. But the feds went a step further, not only talking about the improvement in dealing with mental health issues for police officers, they say the city and its citizens also need to better educate themselves.
We'd like to engage the community in a discussion of systemic reform more broadly to ensure that people with mental illness or other forms of acute problems get the kinds of care and support that they need in the community.
It was very emotional. It's just really unfortunate that it took so many lives to be lost before we got to this juncture.
Renata Torres was the mother of Christopher Torres. Police shot the 27-year-old in 2011. Christopher was a diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic. On Thursday, the DOJ has found that the Albuquerque Police Department has used excessive force in past shootings, specifically against people suffering from mental illness. While pleased with these findings, Torres and others who have lost loved ones say their fight for justice isn't over. Mike Gomez's 22-year-old son, Alan, was also killed in 2011.
I'm glad that they found out that things were wrong, but now it's time to do something about it. Now it's time to, that big A word, accountability.
Like the rest of us in the community, if we do something that is heinous and egregious, we have consequences that we are faced with.
Local community groups promise to make sure changes are implemented.
Most of the shooting victims that have been killed are Hispanic.
And so we're gonna fight and represent our community and make sure that our community is treated with dignity and respect.
We need to implement change in this department just as rapidly as possible.
Thursday's announcement marks the end of the Justice Department's civil investigation into the APD, but officials have referred specific shooting cases to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which may pursue criminal charges against officers.
And that criminal division needs to do the right thing so that I can turn my flag right side up.